The Obama administration has approved the first ferry service in decades between the U.S. and Cuba. The move potentially opens a path for hundreds of thousands of people and hundreds of millions of dollars in consumer goods that travel between Florida and Havana each year. And new air service between the U.S. and Cuba will begin in July. JetBlue Airways has gotten approval, I should say, to operate flights between JFK Airport in New York City and Cuba. It'll be the first commercial flight from New York since the easing of travel restrictions in December. You know, back in the 1950s, Cuba had one of the highest standards of living in the Western Hemisphere and a thriving middle class. But the socialist revolution and the U.S. embargo imposed in 1962 changed that, leaving the Cuban economy in shambles. In many ways, it has never recovered. But that recent softening in travel restrictions from the U.S. to Cuba could begin to change that. And more Hoosiers could play a part in Cuba Rediscovered. Like this mostly empty freighter entering the port of Havana, the Cuban people have been waiting for their economic ship to come in. The sugar trade with the U.S. was the foundation of the Cuban economy up until the late 1950s, when the socialist revolution took over and all trade with the U.S. stopped.
And once we cut off the sugar quota with them, this place went into a tailspin. The economy was a disaster. The Russians came in and somewhat saved it until 1991 when they left.
Without a reliable market for exports, Cuba began importing tourists, mostly from Canada and Europe. It's now the third most visited country in the Caribbean. And Cubans are ready to welcome Americans, too.
These people don't hate the American people, never.
Xavier Rodriguez is an artist who sells his work on the El Prado, a major pedestrian walkway in the heart of downtown.
It's good for me. It's good for me. It's obvious. It's good. It's good for us.
But is it really? Cubans are optimistic about what Americans will do for their economy, but they may not be ready to take advantage of it. Few people here speak English. They've had no reason to learn it for 3 generations. Five-star hotels like the Anglaterra are scarce, and outside of bars, restaurants, and a few shops selling cheap souvenirs, there's not much on which tourists can spend their money. And even when they do, it will take years before that economic boost will spread beyond the people who deal directly with the visitors. This area is miles from the tourist centers of downtown Havana, with homes that flood during the rainy season. Very few foreigners stray this far from downtown. But even here, news that more Americans may be coming to Cuba is reason for optimism. The Banjuito is one of the poorest neighborhoods in Havana.
He doesn't see Americans here very often.
Elisar Morales has a private restaurant at his home. Behind the small house, cages hold what's on the menu in front. With no customers today, he's fixing the cistern that collects water and thinking optimistically about the big picture.
He thinks that all of the Americans that are coming here will help all of the Cuban people.
And right around the corner, more optimism.
Working tonight in Palco Hotel.
From Henrico Diaz, a drummer for a band that plays at a downtown restaurant. He invited us into his home, and it's not necessary to translate what he told us.
But I think in turismo americano, economía en Cuba.
The Cuban government is already preparing for more tourists from America, putting on a fresh face by rehabbing old buildings and fixing broken down streets. It's been a long process because the blockade makes it hard to get building supplies.
It will be greatly ironic if the Americans are in fact the ones that come here and save this place.
And you think that's going to happen?
I think it is definitely going to happen.
Eventually. Undoing 50 years of sanctions will not happen overnight. But optimism is contagious, and Cubans are once again looking for economic salvation from their nearest neighbor to the north. And tomorrow night we'll take a look at a day in the life of a Cuban woman who lives with her mother and son and runs a small casa particular, a bed and breakfast in Havana. You may be surprised as to how she spends her day. Also, we have some great web extras from our Cuba Rediscovered trip on our website. You'll find it at WTHR.com.